Usually when we talk about a diagnosis, whether it's a doctor looking at your chart or, I don't know, a mechanic looking at your car, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Right. It's binary. Like it works or it doesn't.
Exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the bone, and the doctor just points and says, there it is, that's the problem. You get a concrete answer.
Yeah, but then you step into the world of literature or sociology.
Right. Step into philosophy, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely useless. The diagnostic landscape of the human soul is, well, it's incredibly murky.
It's massively daunting because you're essentially trying to find empirical evidence for a spiritual absence.
Which is exactly the huge, ambitious question we are asking today.
Yeah.
How do you diagnose a broken world? How do you point at an entire epoch of human history and say, that is the exact moment we lost our sense of meaning?
And that is the mission of this deep dive. We are exploring one of the most famously difficult, deeply influential, and honestly, oddly beautiful works of literary theory ever written. Georg Lukács' The Theory of the Novel.
I have to admit, when I first looked at our stack of source material for this one, I was pretty intimidated. I mean, we are looking at scholarly critiques from heavy hitters like Paul de Man and Frederick Jameson.
And Lucien Goldman, too.
Right, and Lukács' own retrospective preface, which he wrote in 1962, decades after the book originally dropped. But here's the hook for anyone listening who thinks this is just going to be, a dry academic lecture on how to structure a narrative arc.
Oh, it is definitely not that.
Not at all. This isn't just a book about how novels work. It's actually a disguised spiritual autobiography.
Yeah, written by a man who is teetering on the absolute brink of suicide.
Exactly. Right during the outbreak of World War I. And in his desperate attempt to figure out how literature functions, he accidentally diagnosed the modern condition. He gave us a term that will honestly haunt you once you understand it. Transcendental homelessness.
It's such a powerful phrase. We're going to unpack how a book ostensibly about the history of literary genres morphed into this profound philosophy of modernity.
And human alienation.
Yeah.
And our endless search for meaning. Which is why I want to say this directly to you, the listener, before we dive into the deep end. Whether you're an avid reader, a student of history, or just someone who occasionally looks at the structures of modern life, your job, your social media, paying taxes, and feels entirely disconnected from it all.
Yeah, that feeling of isolation.
Right. This text is essentially writing about you. It's a mirror reflecting why we feel that specific hollow way when we look around today.
But to understand the theory, we can't just start with the abstract ideas. We really have to start with the man.
The crucible he was in. We need to go back to 1914.
We do, because the theory of the novel is totally inseparable from the intense, despairing context in which it was forged. To understand Lukács in that exact moment, we have to look at his personal chaos.
So set the scene for us. Who was he at this point?
So he was born in 1885 in Budapest to a very wealthy Jewish banking family. And he was writing this book in 1914 and 1915 in Heidelberg, Germany.
Right as the Great War is erupting across Europe.
Exactly. And looking back years later, Lukács himself described the creation of this book as a product of, and this is a quote, permanent despair over the state of the world.
I mean, permanent despair. I've had bad weeks where I felt, unmotivated to write an email, let alone draft a foundational text of 20th century philosophy. What was driving that level of darkness?
To really grasp that, historians point to this remarkable physical artifact, the Heidelberg suitcase.
Oh, I love this detail.
It's incredible. After Lukács died in 1971 at the age of 86, someone discovered a forgotten valise sitting in the basement vaults of a Heidelberg bank.
He had just left it there.
Yeah, he deposited it when he left Heidelberg for good in 1917 and seemingly never mentioned it to anyone. And inside, they found around 1,650 letters, private diaries, notes for an unwritten book on Dostoevsky, and an essay on German intellectuals reacting to the war.
Okay, I have to know. What was actually in those diaries? When you open a time capsule left by one of the greatest Marxist philosophers of the 20th century, well, before he actually became a Marxist, what are you reading?
You're reading the internal monologue of a man in absolute agony. He was openly recording intense suicidal thoughts.
Wow.
Yeah, the personal tragedies were just piling up. He had recently endured the sudden, devastating death of his closest intellectual companion, Leo Popper.
Oh, man.
And soon after that, his former lover, Irma Seidler, died by suicide.
So he's completely surrounded by grief.
Completely. And then layered on top of this unbearable personal grief, the world essentially sets itself on fire. World War I breaks out.
And this wasn't just any war. It was the first fully mechanized, industrialized slaughter.
Exactly. And Lukács looked at this brutal, senseless meat grinder and intensely, violently rejected the bourgeois world that had created it. He felt Western civilization hadn't just made a political error. It had fallen into a bottomless abyss of alienation.
Let me see if I can translate the vibe here. It's as if you were contracted to write a dry, practical textbook on urban architecture, right?
Okay, yeah.
But because your city is currently being firebombed and burning to the ground outside your window, the book completely derails. It turns into this poetic manifesto about why humans even need shelter in the first place.
That analogy captures the shift perfectly.
Yeah.
And it's not far from the truth of his actual writing process. Lukács didn't sit down intending to write a dense, historico-philosophical essay.
He didn't. What was the original plan?
His original conception was to write a series of dialogues modeled on Boccaccio's Decameron.
Oh, right. The Decameron is about people fleeing the Black Death, retreating to a villa, and telling stories to make sense of the collapsing world.
Exactly. Lukács wanted to write about a group of young intellectuals fleeing the war psychosis of 1914 Europe, withdrawing to try and understand their own souls through intense conversation.
So why didn't we get that version? Why did it become this dense theoretical essay?
He abandoned the dialogue framework because the material was simply too urgent, too theoretical for a fictional framing device. But the intense, elegiac mood of those planned dialogues, that feeling of brilliant young people hiding from the apocalypse, it seeped directly into the finished book.
That explains so much. It's academic, but it's bleeding. But he wasn't just writing from his own raw emotional wounds. He was a highly trained philosopher. The sources mention he was going through a massive intellectual transition at this exact time.
He was moving away from Immanuel Kant and toward G.W.F. Hegel.
Okay, I get lost in 19th century German philosophy pretty easily. Can you help me understand why that shift from Kant to Hegel matters for a book about novels?
It's crucial. Without getting bogged down in the deepest weeds, the shift from Kant to Hegel is about how we view history and reality. Kant's philosophy often deals with rigid categories, how the mind universally structures reality. It can feel somewhat static.
Focused on the limits of knowledge.
Right. Hegel, on the other hand, is all about movement, history, the dialectic. Hegel viewed human history as a grand unfolding process where ideas clash, a thesis meets its opposite, an antithesis, and they resolve into a higher synthesis.
So consciousness is constantly evolving over time.
Yes. So Lukács adopting a Hegelian framework means he isn't just looking at the novel as a static category. He's looking at literature as a living organism that evolves based on the spiritual conditions of the era.
Okay, that helps a lot. So literature is kind of the exhaust fumes of historical evolution.
That's a great way to put it.
But he was also steeped in this other academic tradition, let me get the pronunciation right, Geisteswissenschaften.
Spot on. The Geisteswissenschaften.
What is that, and how did thinkers like Georg Simmel, Max Weber, and Wilhelm Dilthey influence him?
It translates roughly to the intellectual sciences, or human sciences. It was a German academic tradition that strongly opposed the idea that you could study human history the same way you study physics or biology.
So you can't just use strict data-driven empirical analysis.
Exactly. You can't just count how many grain shipments arrived in Rome to understand the Roman soul.
So they were basically anti-spreadsheet. They wanted the vibes of history, not just the data.
In a highly sophisticated way, yes. Thinkers like Dilthey believed that to understand a historical epoch, you had to use intuitive synthesis. You sympathetically enter into the worldview of that time.
By looking at art, religion, philosophy.
Yes, you form a synthetic concept that captures the spirit of the era. Max Weber was doing this with the Protestant work ethic, trying to capture the spirit of capitalism. Lukács took this methodology and applied it directly to aesthetic problems.
He wanted to map the spirit of the modern era by looking at the structure of its art. And the worldview he developed out of all this tragedy and philosophy is what scholars now call romantic anti-capitalism.
Yes, romantic anti-capitalism.
I want to pause there because it sounds almost like an oxymoron today. When we hear anti-capitalism, we immediately think of Marxism, labor unions, wealth redistribution. But Lukács wasn't a Marxist yet, right?
He absolutely was not talking about economics at this stage.
So what was he angry about?
His hatred of capitalism was romantic, aesthetic, and profoundly spiritual. He wasn't angry about surplus value. He was angry about the destruction of the human soul. He borrowed a very dramatic phrase from the philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte.
Oh, what was the phrase?
He called his present time the age of absolute sinfulness.
Wow. The age of absolute sinfulness. That is heavy. It sounds biblical.
It's meant to carry that apocalyptic weight. Lukács believed the modern capitalist world was driven by a terrifying force of mechanization. Genuine organic human culture was being demolished by cold, calculating civilization.
Where everything is measured by utility.
Exactly. And because the outside world is so hostile, any sensitive individual is forced to retreat inward. You become trapped inside your own head because the world outside is unlivable.
Okay, I think I have the baseline. Lukács is sitting in a room in Heidelberg. His friends are dead. Europe is slaughtering itself with machine guns, and he decides that 1914 is the literal peak of human sin and alienation.
That sums it up.
Knowing this absolute despair, it makes perfect sense that a philosopher would try to find a contrast. If the present is a nightmare, what does a dream look like? What is the opposite of absolute sinfulness?
For that, Lukács points us back to the distant past, specifically to ancient Greece. But not the historical Greece of politicians and merchants. He points to the Greece of the Homeric epic.
Which brings us to what might be one of the most famous, most beautiful opening paragraphs in all of literary theory.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
He starts the book by writing, "Happy are those ages when the starry sky is the map of all possible paths, ages whose paths are illuminated by the light of the stars. Everything in such ages is new and yet familiar, full of adventure and yet their own. The world is wide, and yet it is like a home, for the fire that burns in the soul is of the same essential nature as the stars."
It is breathtaking writing.
It's haunting. But let's demystify it. What is the actual philosophical significance of this starry sky metaphor?
It's doing heavy philosophical lifting. The starry sky represents a world where guidance is perfectly clear. Meaning is literally written into the fabric of the cosmos.
So if the stars are your map, you never have to guess your purpose.
Right. The universe itself tells you. The outside world and your internal world are made of the exact same stuff. Lukács uses this to describe what he calls integrated civilizations.
Integrated civilization. I want to make sure I really grasp this because it seems foundational to everything that comes later. What does it actually mean to live in one?
Well, as Lukács imagines it in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, life and meaning are entirely identical. Think about how modern humans struggle with the question, what is the meaning of my life?
Yeah, we treat our life as one thing and meaning as this separate buried treasure we have to go find.
Exactly. But in Lukács' Greece, that question would be nonsensical. Being and destiny are the exact same thing. Meaning is immanent. It is baked directly into the physical world and your daily actions. There is no unbridgeable chasm between the individual and the community.
So the soul doesn't feel trapped inside a body looking out at a hostile world.
Precisely. Or rather, to avoid just agreeing with you, I'd say it goes even deeper. The soul stands right in the middle of the world, and its boundaries are no different from the physical things around it. Lukács calls this world homogeneous.
Every object, every battle is suffused with absolute meaning.
Yes.
This makes me think of the heroes in those epics. Achilles or Odysseus, we tend to view them through our modern lens as these ultimate individual badasses on personal journeys. But under this theory, that's a misreading, isn't it?
That is a phenomenal observation. It's a massive point for Lukács. The epic hero is never an individual in the modern sense. They do not have a private, internal psychology that is at odds with the world.
So Achilles doesn't sit in his tent wondering if being a warrior is his true, authentic truth.
Exactly, or if he should take up painting instead. His destiny is completely intertwined with the destiny of the entire community. He is a representative figure. There is a complete distancelessness between his soul and his world.
Okay, I hear all this, and the poetry is beautiful, but I have to push back hard here.
Go for it.
On behalf of anyone who has taken a basic history class, isn't Lukács just doing what literally every generation does? Romanticizing a mythical golden age that never actually existed.
Right, the nostalgia trap.
Yeah. I mean, ancient Greece was brutal. They had rampant slavery, horrific wars, subjugation of women. It was not a harmonious utopian summer camp. How could a brilliant philosopher ignore all of that?
He doesn't ignore it. And he isn't a bad historian. He explicitly states that his ancient Greece is not a historical reality. He refers to it as a transcendental topography, a philosophical ideal.
Wait, so he knows he's making it up. Why base your entire theory on a fairy tale?
Because he needs a theoretical baseline. He's asking a thought experiment. What would human consciousness look like before it felt separated from the physical world?
Oh.
He uses this idealization not as a bad history book, but as a philosophical measuring stick. Think of it like physics. We use the concept of a frictionless vacuum to understand the laws of motion, even though a perfectly frictionless vacuum doesn't exist.
Right.
Homeric Greece is Lukács's frictionless vacuum. It is his absolute zero of alienation. You can't measure how deeply fragmented modern humans are unless you have a baseline of perfect, unalienated integration to compare it to.
Ah, okay, the absolute zero of alienation. That makes total sense. He needs a pure white canvas so we can see the black paint splatters. So having established this hypothetical perfect unity, this totality, we have to trace the fall.
Yes, the fall of human consciousness.
How did we fall from that perfectly integrated state? Because obviously we don't live in a Homeric epic anymore.
Lukács traces this fall through the evolution of Greek culture itself. The seamless totality of the Homeric epic eventually fractures and gives way to the era of Greek tragedy. In tragedy, we see the very first cracks in the cosmos.
What happens in those cracks?
Life and essence begin to separate. Lukács writes that in tragedy, pure essence awakens to life, and every day, mere life sinks into not being.
Can you give me an example of how that works?
Think of Oedipus or Antigone. Suddenly, the hero is at odds with the laws of the world or the state. They are confronted with a terrible, isolating choice. Tragedy introduces the concept of profound loneliness.
But the world hasn't totally shattered yet, has it?
No, not yet. In Greek tragedy, there is still a tether connecting the lonely hero to the community, and that tether is the chorus. The chorus provides a shared moral universe, a community of essence. The hero is lonely, but their tragedies still have a clear meaning to the community.
So the crack is forming, the ice is splintering, but we haven't fallen through the frozen lake yet? When does the world completely shatter?
It shatters with philosophy, and specifically the villain of this story for Lukács is Plato.
Okay, I am so intrigued by this. Usually Plato is the hero of Western thought, the guy who gave us reason, the cave allegory, logic. Why is Plato the bad guy who breaks the world?
Because for Lukács, Plato represents the exact moment when meaning became a transcendent reality. Think about Plato's theory of forms.
The idea that the physical world is just a flawed copy.
Exactly. Plato argued that the physical trees and chairs are just shadowy copies of perfect forms that exist in some abstract heavenly realm.
Right, the shadows on the cave wall.
Yes. But look at what that does philosophically. It completely divorces meaning from everyday empirical life. Before Plato, meaning was in the physical tree, the physical battle. With Plato, true essence is suddenly elevated into an otherworldly realm we can't touch.
The mind and the world are now officially split.
Meaning is no longer immanent. It's no longer inside things. It has become transcendent. It's floated away into the sky, separate from us.
This is a mind-bending way to look at history. He's saying that the invention of abstract philosophy wasn't an upgrade. It was the moment we lost our home in the physical world. And this is where Lukács is wrestling with Hegel, right? He essentially turns Hegel upside down.
He flips it completely. Hegel believed that this historical process, the separation of mind from unreflective unity, moving toward a highly rationalized world, was the ultimate story of progress. Hegel called this modern era the world of prose.
Hegel thought that was a good thing.
He thought it was the triumph of the human spirit. But for the young Lukács, writing in the blood-soaked despair of 1914, this rationalization is not progress. It is a catastrophic, unrecoverable loss. He sees the onset of logic and self-consciousness as a tragic fall from grace.
Which brings us to the absolute centerpiece of this entire deep dive, the diagnosis, the most famous phrase Lukács coined. Transcendental Obdachlosigkeit, transcendental homelessness.
He is a stunning phrase.
I want to spend some real time here, because this is the concept that reaches out from 1914 and grabs us by the collar today.
Transcendental homelessness is the defining condition of modern humans. It is the condition of a subject, a person, who has lost any pre-established harmony with the world. You have lost your transcendental place in the order of being.
Let's ground this for the listener. Think about how often you feel like you are supposed to be following a map. Maybe it's a map for your career, go to college, get a job, climb the ladder.
Or for relationships, date, marry, buy a house.
Exactly. You are following the map society gave you, but when you look at your windshield, the map doesn't match the territory. The GPS is routing you into a lake. It feels like you are entirely lost, like you are constantly doing something wrong. Lukács is saying, this is not a personal failure.
No, you aren't bad at life.
This disconnect is the defining structural condition of modern reality. We are all transcendentally homeless. The home we are looking for doesn't exist anymore.
And this philosophical shift has massive aesthetic consequences. Because the fundamental nature of our reality changed. The art forms required to represent that reality had to change. This is the core engine of his literary theory.
Art forms are subject to history.
Yes, to a historico-philosophical dialectic. When the transcendental points of orientation shift, when meaning floats away into the sky, the forms of art must adapt to the new reality, or they die.
So the epic as a literary form has to die.
It has to. You cannot write a Homeric epic in a fragmented, alienated world. The epic requires a world of immanent meaning to function. When meaning departs, the epic must yield its place to a new form that can handle the fragmentation, and that form is the novel. Lukács famously defines the novel as the epic of a world abandoned by God. The novel is the art form of transcendental homelessness.
The epic of a world abandoned by God. That is such a heavy crown to put on a form of entertainment we now buy in airport terminals alongside neck pillows. But let's get into the mechanics of this. Since we live in this state of transcendental homelessness, what does the art form that represents it actually look like structurally?
Well, to explain the mechanics, Lukács first draws a distinction between what he calls minor epic forms and the major epic form. Minor forms would be things like short stories, idylls, novellas.
Where the completeness is subjective.
Exactly. The author takes a tiny fragment of life, a specific incident, and forces it into a finished shape through sheer lyrical will. It's like carving a miniature sculpture out of a single piece of wood. But a major epic form, which includes both the ancient epic and the modern novel, requires something different. It requires what he calls receptivity.
Receptivity meaning the author has to capture everything.
Essentially, yes. The author has to humbly accept the entire world and try to reveal the vast interconnected whole of it. The major epic form aims at totality.
But the Homeric epic and the modern novel reveal that totality very differently, right? Because they are dealing with completely different worlds.
Fundamentally differently. The epic embodies a ready-made totality. The meaning is already there, baked into the cosmos. The epic poet's job is basically just to describe it beautifully. The novelist, however, is standing in a shattered world.
So what does the novelist have to do?
The novelist must construct a totality that is concealed. The novelist has to dig through the rubble of modern life, find fragments of meaning, and try to glue them together into a coherent worldview.
And this explains why prose, regular non-rhyming sentences is the natural language of the modern novel.
Yes. Lukács argues that verse, poetry, is the natural language for a world liberated from earthly fetters. Verse dances. But when an author has to dig through the dirt to disclose buried meaning, when heroes have to break out of their societal prisons, you need prose.
Because prose can encompass the struggle.
Exactly. The mundane suffering, the grit, the bureaucracy, the awkward conversations of real life. It is the only medium flexible and heavy enough to hold a world without God.
Which means the hero of the novel cannot act like Achilles. Achilles just fights because fighting is what he is. But the hero of a novel, what are they doing?
The hero of the novel is necessarily a seeker. The epic hero isn't an individual. He's a representative of a community. But the novel hero is defined by the absence of a direct path. They are alienated. They are alone, searching for a meaning that isn't obviously there.
And what exactly are they searching through? What is the environment of the modern novel? This brings up a crucial concept in his theory: first nature versus second nature. I'd love to break this down because it feels incredibly relevant today.
It is one of his most powerful ideas, and it heavily anticipates his later Marxist work. So, first nature was the epic world. It was the natural world, the forests, the stars, the seasons where meaning was imminent. Second nature is the modern world we actually live in.
The human-made world.
Yes, but specifically, the human-made structures that have grown out of our control. Second nature is the world of rigid social conventions, bureaucracies, institutions, capitalism. Humans created these things to help us, but they've hardened into something alien and oppressive. We no longer control them, they control us.
He has a really dark phrase for this, doesn't he?
He hauntingly describes second nature as a charnel house of long-dead interiorities.
A charnel house is a literal storehouse for dead bones. So he's saying our institutions are made of dead human souls. I picture it like building a sprawling, magnificent city to protect yourself from the wild, but over generations you realize the city is actually a labyrinth that you can't escape. The buildings are tombs of old ideas, and you are trapped navigating the zoning laws of ghosts.
That is an excellent way to visualize it. And it's fascinating because later in his life, when he becomes a hardened Marxist, this existential concept of second nature transforms into the famous Marxist idea of reification, the idea that social relations between people start to look like rigid relationships between things. Capitalism treats human labor as a mere commodity.
But here in 1914, it's not strictly economic yet.
Right. It's a purely existential and aesthetic diagnosis. The novel emerges precisely because we live in this suffocating world of rigid conventions. Second nature is a world from which only the innermost recesses of the soul are exempt.
So if the ancient epic is first nature and the modern novel is trapped in second nature, is there any writer in history who managed to bridge these two worlds, who wrote right during the transition?
Lukács points to Dante Alighieri as the great transitional figure.
Yeah.
He sees Dante's Divine Comedy as a unique masterpiece that sits exactly on the border. Dante managed to achieve epic totality. He captured the whole universe. But he did it by making the transcendent realm, heaven, hell, purgatory, an actual lived architectural experience within the text. Dante built a bridge, but Lukács argues it was a bridge that couldn't be built again once the modern secular era fully set in.
Okay, so if Dante is the ultimate exception, how does a modern novelist actually construct this concealed meaning in a world of dead second nature? If the world is broken, what is the glue that holds a 400-page novel together?
The glue, the governing structural principle of the novel, is irony.
Now, I need to stop you there, because when most of us hear irony, we think of sarcasm or witty dialogue. We think of a tone of voice. But Lukács is using it as a structural architectural term, right?
He is. He's drawing heavily on early German romantics here. For Lukács, irony is not a joke. It is the structural foundation of the novel. Irony is the novelist's profound self-awareness.
The author acknowledging their own limits.
Yes. The writer attempts to create a totality, a complete world with meaning. But through irony, they simultaneously step back and recognize that the forms they are using are inadequate to capture the true complexity of reality.
So it's an admission of failure baked into the success of the writing.
Precisely. Lukács calls this a negative mysticism. In traditional mysticism, you directly experience God or absolute truth. In negative mysticism, you experience the absolute absence of truth. But by recognizing and framing that absence, you paradoxically grasp the shape of the world.
You create an illusion of meaning, but ironically acknowledge that it is just a subjective attempt to force meaning onto a meaningless world.
Exactly.
It's like trying to draw a perfect circle freehand. You know you can't do it, the viewer knows you can't do it, but the beauty and the meaning come from the earnestness of the attempt and the self-awareness of the wobbly lines. This explains why Lukács calls the novel the most hazardous genre, and a form that is forever in process of becoming.
Right. Unlike a sonnet, which has strict rhyme schemes, or a Greek tragedy with fixed rules, the novel has no safety net. It is precariously built entirely on the subjective will of the author trying to synthesize a broken world. It can fail at any moment.
I always picture the structure of the novel like trying to build a suspension bridge while you are simultaneously driving a heavy truck across it. The only thing holding the structure together is the biography of the seeker. You follow the main character's life, and that chronological journey is the only framework that exists.
That is a brilliant analogy. The novel is fundamentally biographical because it has to reconcile a massive abstract system of ideas with the concrete, messy richness of daily life. The individual life becomes the vehicle of values. The hero's timeline is the bridge.
So how do different novelists handle this impossible task of building the bridge while driving on it? Because obviously Jane Austen handles it differently than Herman Melville. Lukács doesn't just leave this abstract. He gives us a typology, right?
Yeah, he does. He offers three main types of novel forms to explain the different ways these seekers try to find meaning in a world of second nature.
Okay, let's look at type 1.
The first type he identifies is abstract idealism. And the ultimate foundational example of this is Cervantes' Don Quixote.
Okay, what is mechanically happening in this type of novel?
In the novel of abstract idealism, the hero possesses what Lukács calls a militant interiority. The hero has a powerful, internally consistent soul full of pure ideals. The problem is that their soul is actually too narrow for the complex, degraded reality of the outside world.
So Don Quixote has a rigid ideal of chivalry, and he violently forces the real world to fit it.
Exactly. He confuses his own ideals with reality.
Right. The classic example, he looks at windmills and truly believes they are monstrous giants he must fight.
Right. And initially, this creates massive comedy. We laugh at the discrepancy between his mind and reality. But Lukács points out that Cervantes' novel captures the exact breaking point of the medieval worldview transitioning into the modern world. Lukács says Quixote's struggle borders on the demonic.
The demonic. That's a strong word for a guy falling off a horse. What does he mean by that?
In Lukács' theory, the demonic occurs when a human soul becomes totally obsessed with an unrealizable, abstract ideal and pursues it relentlessly against all empirical reality, completely losing touch with what is actually happening. It's a terrifying possession by an idea. Quixote is funny, but he is also a tragedy of a soul trapped in a delusion.
Wow. Okay, so type 1 is a hero whose mind is too narrow for the world, leading to demonic comedy. What is type 2?
Type 2 is the exact opposite. He calls it the romanticism of disillusionment. The prime example he uses is Gustave Flaubert's novel Sentimental Education. In this type, the hero's interiority is too vast, too sensitive, too poetic for the mundane, crushing reality of the bourgeois world.
So the world is too small and too petty for their soul.
Yes. And because of this mismatch, the hero is utterly passive. They can't act effectively, like Quixote tries to, because they realize that any action in this degraded world is inherently compromised and meaningless. So they observe, they suffer, and they fail.
But hold on, I'm confused about the mechanics here. If you are writing a 500-page book where the hero is passive and doesn't really do anything, how do you organize the narrative? What is the engine of the book?
That is the genius of Flaubert and of Lukács' analysis. When action fails to provide meaning, the organizing principle of the novel becomes time. Time itself becomes the central axis.
How does that work? How does time replace action?
Because the hero is constantly defeated by the passing of time. Their ideals are crushed, their loves fade, their youth disappears, they are left with nothing but retrospect. Lukács brilliantly notes that in these novels, memory is the only thing that can create unity out of a life of failures.
Oh, wow.
The hero experiences the crushing weight of time passing, and only by looking back through the lens of memory can they find a coherent narrative to their life. The present is awful, but the remembered past becomes poetic.
That is wild. By identifying memory and time as the structural engine of the novel, Lukács is essentially predicting the massive modernist movement before it even fully happens. He's anticipating Marcel Proust or James Joyce, where memory completely replaces traditional plot.
It is one of the most prescient parts of his essay. He saw exactly where the European novel was heading. But he also notes the emotional toll of this form. Because these heroes are constantly defeated by second nature, many of these novels of disillusionment inevitably collapse into profound pessimism. It's a literature of beautiful defeat.
Which naturally brings us to the third type. If type 1 forces its ideals on the world and type 2 retreats from the world into memory, type 3 must be the attempt to find a middle ground.
Precisely. The third type is the attempted synthesis. And his classic model for this is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. This is the foundational text of the Bildungsromans, the novel of education, or the coming-of-age novel.
So how does the Bildungsroman try to fix the problem of transcendental homelessness?
It tries to reconcile the internal self and the external society through lived experience. The hero doesn't violently attack windmills, and he doesn't retreat into passive despair. Instead, the hero actively engages with the world. He makes mistakes, he learns, he compromises, and eventually he finds a productive place within society.
Lived experience serves as an education.
Yes, the inner soul and the outer world reach a truce.
But wait, I want to challenge this Goethe example because I know Lukács challenges it too. Why is Goethe's ending philosophically problematic? If the whole premise of this book is that we live in a fragmented world of dead second nature, how can Wilhelm Meister just happily slot into society at the end? Doesn't that contradict the whole theory?
It does. And that is exactly the issue. The synthesis feels unearned to many readers. The German romantic poet Novalis fiercely criticized Goethe's ending, calling it deeply unpoetic and essentially a betrayal of the romantic spirit.
Novalis basically thought Goethe sold out to the prose of life. He wanted Wilhelm to stay a rebellious poet, not become a productive citizen.
Exactly. Novalis wrote his own novel in response, offering what Lukács calls a fairy tale solution, where the hero's poetic soul magically transforms reality itself. But Lukács ultimately rejects Novalis' fairy tale solution too.
Because magic doesn't exist in modern capitalism.
Right, you can't just wish capitalism away with poetry. However, Lukács still sees Goethe's synthesis as somewhat forced. It is a fragile compromise rather than a true, resounding return to epic totality.
So we've seen how the novel tries to survive in this alienated second nature. But what happens when a writer looks at the entire form of the novel and says, no, this isn't enough. I refuse to compromise. I want to force a return to the epic. To answer that, we have to look to the Russian masters.
Yes, this is where we reach the absolute structural limits of the novel form, primarily by looking at Leo Tolstoy.
How does Tolstoy try to break the rules of the novel to transcend social life?
Tolstoy operates on a massive scale. He finds the conventions of modern European society, the high society balls, the political maneuvering, to be completely false and degraded. So he builds his novels on three distinct layers of reality, trying to dig down to truth.
What are the layers?
The first layer is that sphere of societal conventions, which he portrays with deep irony and satire. The second layer is natural life, the organic rhythms of birth, death, agriculture.
And the third layer?
The third layer is what Lukács calls the great moments. These are the rare, transcendent moments where a character suddenly steps outside of their social identity and feels a deep, mystical unity with the universe itself.
Oh, like that famous scene in War and Peace, where Prince Andrei is lying severely wounded on the battlefield at Austerlitz. He ignores the battle and looks up at the infinite sky, and he realizes the absolute pettiness of Napoleon and earthly ambition, and feels this cosmic peace.
It is exactly that. It is an attempt by Tolstoy to literally look back up at the starry sky from the very first page of Lukács' book. He is trying to force the modern novel back into the Homeric epic.
It's brilliant. But Lukács is a ruthless diagnostician, he asks. Why do Tolstoy's great moments ultimately fail to create a lasting totality?
Because you can't stay on the battlefield looking at the sky forever. The great moments are fleeting, the characters have these profound epiphanies, but then their wounds heal, and they have to go back to living in 19th century society.
They have to pay off gambling debts, arrange marriages.
Right. The epiphany doesn't fundamentally change the structure of the world around them.
Which explains Lukács' take on the ending of War and Peace. I remember being so jarred by the epilogue. After thousands of pages of war and philosophy, it just ends in a domestic nursery with the main characters worrying about babies and household chores.
Lukács points to that specific epilogue as the ultimate proof of the novel's limitations. He says the epilogue is essentially a nursery, a realm of extinguished passion where the great historical struggles are reduced to changing diapers and managing an estate.
Tolstoy couldn't sustain the epic height.
For Lukács, Tolstoy represents the absolute limit of the novel form. He pushes the form as far as it can possibly stretch toward the epic, but because the material world itself hasn't changed, he cannot break through. Tolstoy marks the end, the ultimate exhaustion of European romanticism.
Which leads to what I think is the most shocking claim in the entire book. He writes, flat out, in the final pages, Dostoevsky did not write novels. What on earth does he mean by that? If Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov aren't novels, what are they?
It is a deliberately provocative statement designed to explode the categories he just spent the whole book building. What Lukács means is that Dostoevsky stands completely outside the European novel tradition of disillusionment and social struggle. Dostoevsky doesn't write about characters trying to find a comfortable place in bourgeois society.
So what is he writing?
Lukács believed Dostoevsky was offering a glimpse of a renewed epic. He thought Dostoevsky was pointing toward a totally new utopian world of humanized reality. In Dostoevsky's world, souls interact with other souls directly, completely stripping away the artificial second nature of class and manners. It is raw spirit colliding with raw spirit.
And if we bring this back to the context of 1914, this all starts to make incredible sense personally for Lukács. He was obsessed with Dostoevsky and with the Russian idea. He was deeply interested in these revolutionary characters who operated on what he called the imperatives of the soul rather than the laws of society. He wasn't just analyzing literature anymore. He was looking for a way out of his own despair.
He absolutely was. Lukács was projecting his own intense political and spiritual yearnings onto Dostoevsky. He was looking for a philosophical justification for a total revolution. He believed that only a total destruction of the current order could usher in a new, unalienated epic age.
And the craziest part of this story is that he actually found his revolution. Not long after writing this book of dense, mournful literary theory, he made an astonishing leap into real-world violent politics. He joined the Hungarian Communist Party in 1918. He went from a despairing, suicidal, romantic intellectual sitting in a library to a disciplined, militant Marxist.
Out of here. Which transitions us perfectly to the final fascinating chapter of this story, the legacy of the book, its inherent flaws, and how the older Marxist Lukács viewed the young, romantic Lukács who wrote it.
Lukács survived the turbulent 20th century, which is a miracle in itself. He lived through exile in Moscow during the height of the Stalinist purges, and he eventually wrote a new preface to the theory of the novel in 1962. And in this preface, he delivers a searing self-criticism of his own masterpiece.
He was ruthless with his younger self. In 1962, analyzing his work through a strict Marxist lens, he called his former Geisteswissenschaften methodology an arbitrary synthetic method.
So he completely disowned his previous approach.
Pretty much. He argued that by trying to synthesize whole epochs through intuition rather than hard socioeconomic analysis, he had created a completely upside-down view of history. He said his method failed to properly grasp the actual class dynamics driving writers like Balzac or Flaubert.
Did he talk about the typology being flawed?
Yes. He recognized that his neat three-part typology was far too rigid. He admitted that major novelists like Daniel Defoe or Stendhal simply didn't fit his schema at all.
But even while he is tearing his own book down, he acknowledges its importance, doesn't he?
He does. He admits that, despite its flaws, it was the first time Hegelian philosophy was concretely and successfully applied to aesthetic problems in that specific sociological school of thought.
To understand the difference between the early Hegelian Lukács and the later Marxist Lukács, we can use philosopher Isaiah Berlin's famous concept of the fox and the hedgehog, right?
Exactly. The literary critic David Miles argues that Lukács was the ultimate hedgehog. The fox knows many things, exploring infinite variety, while the hedgehog knows one big thing, relating everything to a single, central, unifying vision.
So what was his one big thing?
In his early days, his one big thing was the Hegelian dialectic of history and the romantic yearning for totality. Later, his one big thing just swapped out. It became Marxist historical materialism. But the structure of his mind, the desire for a single, totalizing explanation of reality, never changed.
And you can see the DNA of his later Marxism right here in this 1914 text. We mentioned it earlier, but it is vital. The concept of second nature morphs directly into the Marxist concept of reification. In the theory of the novel, second nature is an aesthetic and existential problem. Institutions feel alien to the soul. A decade later, in his famous 1923 book, History and Class Consciousness, reification is an economic and political problem. Capitalism literally turns human relations into commodities.
His romantic anti-capitalism, which was initially based on spiritual despair, hardened into actual communism based on economic critique.
And we should clarify for the listener, we are imparting this purely as a historical and philosophical genealogy of ideas. The political implications of his shift, particularly his later alignment with Stalinism, are widely condemned and fiercely debated. We are just tracing the intellectual pipeline.
Right. You cannot ignore how the spiritual despair of 1914 was the direct fuel for the political radicalism of 1918. He was looking for a way to cure transcendental homelessness, and he thought communism was the hammer that could shatter second nature and bring the epic back.
But despite his own intense criticisms, and despite the fact that his historical method was flawed and his categories left out major authors, the theory of the novel remains incredibly influential. It is still taught constantly today. Why?
Because it hits an exposed nerve in the modern consciousness. Its influence on the sociology of culture and critical theory is immense, particularly on the Frankfurt School thinkers like Theodor Adorno and Walter Benjamin.
And his concept of irony was huge too, right?
Massive. The idea that the structural foundation of the novel is the author constantly reflecting on the limits of their own creation deeply anticipated Mikhail Bakhtin's theories of the dialogic imagination, and it laid the groundwork for much of postmodern literary theory.
So, summarizing the legacy, the historical timeline might be rigid. The typology of novels might leave out a ton of great writers. The idealization of ancient Greece as this perfect, harmonious utopia is definitely historically dubious, but the diagnostic power of the book is utterly unmatched.
He nailed the feeling of modernity.
He recognized that in our world, the search for meaning has become more important and more definitional to our art than the actual discovery of it.
The book operates brilliantly as a philosophy of modernity. What Lukács teaches us about alienation and community is that art forms do not just exist in a vacuum. They are the direct, unavoidable symptoms of our spiritual condition.
Yeah.
The opposition between the epic and the novel might be historically flawed as a strict linear timeline, but as a conceptual masterclass in understanding how we tell stories about our own isolation, it remains brilliant.
Okay, let's bring this all together. We set out on a massive mission today. We explored how a heartbroken, despairing philosopher sitting in Heidelberg while Europe tore itself apart with trench warfare looked back at the starry sky of ancient Greece and realized the modern world had lost its map.
We saw how he traced that fall through tragedy and philosophy, arriving at this haunting concept of transcendental homelessness.
We broke down how the novel isn't just a paperback you buy at the airport to pass the time, but the ultimate artistic expression of a soul trying to find a home in a world made of rigid, alienating second nature.
And we saw how seekers try to navigate that labyrinth, either by tilting at windmills like Quixote, drowning in the melancholy memory of lost time like Flaubert's hero, or desperately reaching for cosmic epiphanies on the battlefield like Tolstoy.
It is a profound, tragic trajectory, from spiritual yearning to literary theory, and eventually to political revolution. So I want to say this directly to you, the listener. Next time you read a novel, or even just next time you feel that creeping sense of isolation in our hyper-connected but often incredibly hollow modern world, remember Lukács. That feeling of being a seeker in a world without clear answers, that feeling of homesickness for a place you've never actually been, that isn't a glitch in your psychology. According to Lukács, that is the very engine of modern art. It is the defining condition of our time.
And this raises a vital, provocative question for us to leave on. If the novel was the ultimate art form of transcendental homelessness for the 19th and 20th centuries, what about today? Our current digital age has fractured our shared reality even further, breaking us away from even the shared second nature of institutions and dividing us into millions of personalized, algorithm-driven echo chambers.
So what is the art form of our time?
Are we still writing novels of disillusionment? Or have we entered a new, unprecedented age of digital second nature that requires an entirely new form of storytelling, a new structural irony to help us find our way back to true community?
That is a question that will keep me up tonight. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.